Ann Bailey, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the South Carolina Historical Society, and our museum and archives is located in Charleston. And what I would like to do is use some maps that we have in our collection in order to show relationships and surveying and how that can change as we look at different time periods across the history of South Carolina. And I'm particularly going to be looking at the Catawba. And so I'd like to start with a map where we look at the different Native American groups that were once all living in the state of South Carolina. So if you look at this map, this is actually from the South Carolina Geographic Alliance, and it is a representation of the Native Americans that would have been living in what we now know as South Carolina in about 1670. Now, we know the Native groups were living here for many years prior to this, but the reason that this year was likely chosen is that this is when Charlestown became a city that was settled as part of the colony of Carolina, and people started arriving to settle and colonize the area. Now, this was not the first time that there had been contact with the native groups and the Europeans. That was actually in the 1500s when Hernando de Soto came through and he was searching for gold. But we're going to be taking a look starting here in 1670. And if we look here, we can see the Catawba are located right up here. This is kind of that Piedmont region that kind of expands all the way through in here. And then we go down to the Sand Hills and then the lower areas of our state down here. And this is actually kind of this area where we're going to be focusing on with our different maps today. So that takes us to our very first map. Well, our second map, actually. So this is a map. And unfortunately, this is not a map that we have in our collection, but that would be great if we did. But this is actually from the Library of Congress. So this is commonly known as the deerskin map from 1721. So we've gone from the 1670 map to about 1721. Its more precise name is Map of Several Nations of Indians to the Northwest of South Carolina. And it was presented to Governor Francis Nicholson and likely made by a Catawba person, but there are some historians that suggest maybe it actually been someone from the Cherokee. And it is actually, the original was lost, but the governor at the time had a couple of duplicates made, which is why we're able to take a look at this. Now, you may be thinking, well, this doesn't really look much like a map. It's not necessarily geographically correct, all right? And we're going to figure out why this is a good map to use, even if it may not show, so to speak, correct geography. So let's take a look at what we do see here. We see Charlestown, which is what it was called before the Revolutionary War. And then if we look at some other things that we see Virginia, located here. And then these are actually all names of different groups of native people, and that when I first looked at it, I was not as familiar with all of these, but I could tell that this was the Cherokee. And so that's where I had to start some of my research. And it turns out that this here says Nassau, N-A-S-A-W, which is a form of Yaiswa, which is what the nickname, so to speak, for the Catawba is, as people of the river. And all these different groups, a lot of them ended up kind of melding, so to speak, or absorbed into a larger group that is now known as the Catawba. Obviously, there were wars with the New Europeans and with other tribes. There were smallpox epidemics and other diseases, and their numbers dwindled fairly quickly, which is why they ended up all kind of becoming Catawba. But let's focus on our different groups here. So this is the Nassau here, and I started looking at these other ones, and I was not as familiar with them. So what I did is I found out some of these different words or terms or spellings that could have been used. And it turns out that if I take a look back at this one, I see on this side, the hopefully pronouncing correctly, Uchief. which turns out is located here with a different spelling. The Sherall over here is actually located here with a different spelling. And then the other one I noticed here was the Wateree, which is located here. So that just kind of gives you a few different examples there. And they're not necessarily in what we would assume the geographic location is if we were looking at a correct representation of South Carolina. Let me turn this light on. Okay, so if I continue looking at this. So, once again, we had Charlestown, we had Virginia. I have all of these different groups in the middle. And I'm going to start looking here at the English path to Nassau. All right, so I'm showing what is a road, a trading path, possibly, to the Nassau. You start looking at that relationship then, because then it continues on to Virginia. Perhaps this is showing the trading relationships, or the different ways that communication was between these different groups. So if I was a settler living in Charlestown, perhaps I had a direct path to the Nassau, and then from there to Virginia. All right, I notice also that there's a path, a whole separate path that goes up and around to the Cherokee, and there is not a direct path located here. All right, so perhaps they did not directly trade with each other. Perhaps it was because they were on separate parts of land, or they were warring tribes, which made me think, hold on, the Cherokee were also on this map. And I noticed the Catawba-Cherokee boundary zone. So perhaps that's showing that they were not in communication or in trading with each other because of this boundary between the two. Taking a look at some of these other paths that are showing these going from one group to another. So this isn't necessarily specific roads, but perhaps relationships, and that this group was in communication with this one, that was in communication with this one, and perhaps it's showing more of that aspect of these relationships. One other thing that I happen to notice is that here I have the Europeans that had settled here, and Europeans that had settled here, and they are located in squares with straight lines, and all of these groups are in round circles. Maybe there's something to be said for that. I noticed here, this says an Indian a-hunting. So we have a character here and an animal here. There's also another one located over here. And so I started kind of trying to put all this together in terms of this relationships. And if we know where the Catawba, that we are now as the Catawba, were located, and figuring out where these others were, and turns out this is the it's not even in the screen, the Chickasaw over here, which were actually not necessarily in what we now call as South Carolina, but towards the outskirts of the state. For example, if I bring you back to this one, they're more out in this area and beyond. So perhaps that is why there's that direct trading or social relationship between those two, because they're located out here further away from the other groups. So that's the first one I wanted to show you. That it's a map, but it's not necessarily a map that you or your students are used to using when you are teaching. So that brings me to the next map that I want to look at. And this map is housed in our collection. So this is a map that is titled just Map of Catawba Land, 1764. And there's a couple of different things that I want to point out on this before I show kind of a different version of it. But you can see rivers. These are the rivers. Okay, it was obviously a little folded here in the middle, so it's a little tricky to see. But I see some sort of border lines around the edges here with notes written on the side. I see things written here in the middle and down here at the bottom as well. So I'm actually going to show you this version instead. So I kind of expanded it a little bit so that I can take a closer look at some of it and make it a little bit easier for us to take a look at. So the first thing I'd like to show you is the writing that is down here at the bottom. Okay, and this is where I found out what was going on here. So this is a map of the Catawba Indian land, and this is in a treaty that was entered into in, well, it was originally in 1760 at the Treaty of Pine Tree Hill, but it was formalized in actually Augusta, Georgia, in November of 1763. And so it's the governors of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, as well as some Indian chiefs. It does not mention exactly those Indian chiefs. And so what it is doing is it is setting up an area of land of 144,000 acres that is granted to the Catawba. And it was actually kind of as a so to speak, thank you, because the Catawba fought with the British in the French and Indian Wars. And the Catawba, of course, over the years, this is now in 1760, have been struggling to hold on to their land. Like I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of settlers moving in this case, surveyors who are trying to map and find areas of land for people to move on to. The surveyor of this particular map is a man named Samuel Wiley. And so they had been struggling with this and had been wanting to get some help for this. So this is the attempt to be able to do that. So let's continue taking a look at this. If you'll notice, and I'm going to kind of focus in a little bit, that the way that I am looking at this, it's upside down. Okay? The writing is upside down. However, this says down here, south. So then I thought, okay, well, we would assume that when Mr. Wiley and maybe his crew was traveling about surveying, that they were turning it around as they were writing based on where they could find a good surface to write. So that's kind of what made me think of that. All right, so as I kept looking at this, this says an old Indian town, okay? As you can see, this running straight through is what is the Catawba River. This is North Carolina up here, okay? So that's the Catawba River, and it goes straight down all the way towards the bottom. Now this part is still South Carolina here, okay? So it just continues down. It actually was the Wateree, and then it turned into the Catawba. All right, so then I can take a look at some other things here, all of these creeks and all of these smaller areas and branches of the main river here. And then these black lines are these different trading paths that I actually looked at. So I'm going to turn it around so we can kind of take a closer look here. This says over here, Virginia trading path. Okay, so if I was still like this, remember, it's kind of tricky to kind of get our bearings. Okay, then this would be heading north up towards Virginia there. All right, this is the path from the old Indian town to Fishing Creek, all right, located here. This one is the road from Salisbury to Charleston. This is interesting because that is also a very old colonial town in North Carolina, okay, so it's kind of heading up there as well if it were to continue. The one thing I did find interesting that I thought was interesting, especially for students, is that I have outlined the entire border in green, okay, if you'll notice that. And each of these is actually a tree. And so that makes us think that, well, there's not a fence going down, a line going down. I think sometimes students think, you know, that there's like a paint line drawn on the ground to show these things, and there's not. And in this case, it was marked with the names of trees as this was being surveyed. I'm so sorry, this is not looking good. If you ask me for these maps, I'll make sure you get excellent copies of them. So we got all different trees that are actually pinpointed here making this border. Now, in order to really figure out where this is located, I actually have this large map. Okay. I'll lay this back under here for us. And this is the accurate map of North and South Carolina with their Indian frontiers, showing mountains, rivers, swamps, marshes, bays, creeks, etc. And this is a great map, Okay, and this map was at first created in about 1775. This copy, which is a copy, it's not the original, was reissued in 1794 by surveyor Henry Mouzon, I believe is how we say his name. And there's actually been some research that shows that maybe he wasn't as involved in it as people once thought. Okay, but let's take a look here. We can find South Carolina, okay? It's this border here. Goes around in here. Here's our ocean. Comes back around this way. And I have, in green, shown us that exact same area that was on our other map, which was this one. So this is really putting it into exactly where we are located. Okay? And so I went in further to get an excellent picture to look at. So here's that border. This is the old boundary line, but that's a story for another day. Up and around, okay? See, it's following the exact border of South Carolina, and then it heads up and goes back across. So this is that Catawba Nation that was set aside. Now, actually, today, they do not have that many acres. They are only about 700 acres today. And so just because this was created doesn't mean that it stayed that way. This is not the exact same land that they have today. But I can still see the Catawba River running straight through. Once again, remember their nickname was Yaiswa, which means the river people, or people of the river. And then I have 12 Mile Creek going in this direction and Sugar Creek going in this direction. And I thought, okay, well, let me make sure that I've been looking at this correctly, and I can go back to this map, and once again, I can see 12 Mile Creek. And so I can see that that is going together with 12 Mile Creek around here towards the bottom, just like it is on this one, okay? I've also put some of these roads on here, okay? These trading paths that are going in these different directions. And this is actually the one that comes straight down. It's long, kind of has a couple of different options as it kind of travels through. But this is the Catawba Trading Path. Oh, excuse me, I'm not even showing you the whole thing. This is the Catawba Trading Path that actually is going to go all the way down to Charleston. So that shows you a little bit about how that land has been kind of divvied up, we could say. When we started at the beginning, everyone just had their particular areas, their relationships, possibly. But now we see that they are actually bordered by what was granted to them. We say the border boundary line between North and South Carolina. And a lot of these actual trading paths were kind of the guideline when official roads, maybe state roads, interstates were put in. But that's a map for another day. So just to kind of give you a little bit more information on this, this was actually not the end of the story, like I said, for the Catawba. There ended up being another treaty later on, but that's, once again, not in the colonial time period, so we'll save that for another time. When it came to this Treaty of Pine Tree Hill that started this actual reservation for the Catawba, the chief, so to speak, was a man named Hagler, Hagler, and he was kind of the one who pushed for getting some sort of land grant or agreement or treaty with the British in order to keep their land together. Unfortunately, he did not survive much later after that actual treaty. But this is just kind of a great way to look at a couple of different maps and show one particular group of people. This could be done with a particular town and how a town has changed, or how its borders were created. And so hopefully this kind of gave you some ideas of ways to look at maps. And if you are interested in getting a scanned image of any of these, or a particular lesson just for your students, then please reach out to me by going to the SCHS Education website. Thank you.